Okay, good evening. And thanks to all of you for being here today for our open house lecture and conversation with Jennifer Bonner. It is a distinct pleasure to introduce Jennifer Bonner to the A School today. A graduate of Auburn University and the Harvard Graduate School of Design, Jennifer and her design practice MAL exemplifies an emerging generation of architects that are interested in a creative project that is both avant-garde and grounded in precise architectural references. Her work not only addresses specific design challenges, but also codifies them in a larger catalog of architectural references, establishing affinities and breaks with the many foundational concepts of the 20th century. You could argue that her work is a collection of essays in form. Her experimental and built projects convey architectural lessons that establish a critical position towards the past, and in doing so, help us hallucinate about the future. For example, in Haus Gables, which I'm sure we'll see today, the plan is constructed as a response to Le Corbusier's free plan and Adolf Lowe's round plan. Or in the case of Best Sandwiches, where one finds a fresh take on Colin Rowe's notion of phenomenal transparency, in Jennifer's case, infused with color as a device to manipulate depth of field. Extensively recognized and published, her work has received multiple awards, including the Emerging Voices Award for the AIA Young Architects Forum, 2 Faculty Design Awards from the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture, and a Next Progressives Award from Architects Magazine. Jennifer's creative work has been published in architectural trade journals including Architect, Architectural Review, Architectural Record, and Wallpaper, as well as more experimental publications including A&T, Art Papers, and Mass Context. As a practitioner, an educator, and the director of the Masters of Architecture II program at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, Jennifer has become a leading voice for a younger generation of architects. And as we celebrate the end of our fall open house here at the A School today, I really cannot think of a better person with whom to have a conversation about the importance of developing a personal voice as we address the collective affair of shaping our environments. Please help me give a warm welcome to Jennifer Bonner. I forgot the lecture about the lights. You're doing it. Oh, good.
Okay, is this on? Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Thank you, Felipe, for the introduction. And I'd like to just thank everyone for coming this evening, and especially the students that I had a little interview with earlier today, which was kind of questioning what I was thinking about contemporary issues in architecture. So I'm going to not do a 1-hour lecture. It's going to be shorter. It's going to be like 30, 40 minutes. And then Felipe, I think, are going to have a discussion. But I titled tonight's short talk Loopty Loops, which is partly about the name of my practice, but also that thing you do when you're driving. Can you check your mic? I think we can't hear you. Is that? Okay. I can hear myself, but
maybe just speak closer.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah. So tonight's talk, Loopty Loops, is partly about the name of my practice, but also that thing you do when you're driving and you realize that you've taken the wrong turn. It's that optimistic loopty loop that circles us back around towards the right direction. And for the faculty and administration that are probably slightly nervous about what I'm going to present, don't worry, this is going to be a talk on architecture. This evening, the aim is to show one project in detail, which will describe the conceptual and intellectual project around questions of ordinary architecture. That the term is Venturi Scott Brown's, not my own, but I do see the work fitting inside of a larger lineage. This work on the ordinary began as a research titled Domestic Hats, and it led to a series of exhibitions, models, drawings, and writings, all in an effort to kind of unpack a capital P project from my practice. And the goal is to take what might be deemed conceptual, highly conceptual, and flip it into a real building. My work often begins with a question rather than a sketch. It relates directly to popular culture, it is graphic, and it takes cues from art practice. So Domestic Hats is on the left, and the architecture on the right is House Gables. It's located in Atlanta, Georgia. It is a conceptual project around 87 cross-laminated timber panels, 3 representational models, 1,700 square feet of glitter stucco. I'm going to explain all this later. 10 faux finishes, and a proposal for what I'm calling a roof plan ideology. So this is a suggestion on how the discipline might shift into a new spatial paradigm, rejecting the free plan and the romp plan of the past. So MAL is the name of the practice. It stands for Mass Architectural Loop-de-Loops. And as we know, the acronym is a 20th century Americanism. It's in wide circulation. Americans love their shorthand. And so this is what MAL looks like, sitting in a sea of known acronyms outside of our discipline, ranging from governmental agencies to best social media practices, OMG. And here, MAL down at the bottom sits amongst other architectural practices which also use acronyms. Firms like Foster & Partner and David Chipperfield Architects, who were my former employer in London. So MAL uses short form as a way of allowing the long form name to change from month to month or when our architectural interests shift for each project. MAL is interested in an intellectual project, not a formal one. So that's why our architecture tends to look differently from project to project, meaning there is no formulaic formal process. MAL can also mean miniature angles and little lines, or maximum arches with limited liability. And we always can add a C if we're feeling like we want to be professional. So before I introduce this body of work around ordinary architecture, I'd like to quickly show previous work, which kind of represents a cross-section of failed competition entries, gallery installations, publications, and temporary architectural experiments in the public realm. And so they're what we call MAL's best practices, and their strategies, I think, for really misbehaving in architecture. And so I'm going to kind of run through them in the top 10 kind of strategies. So number 1, flood a gallery on Hollywood Boulevard. This is a project where I was living in Los Angeles for a number of years, teaching at Woodbury University, and everybody was talking about water all the time. There's not enough of it. We have a drought. We have too much water. There's a water ban. There's not a water ban. And so I asked attendees to put on these plastic boot coverings and wade through this basically swimming pool, or wading pool, sorry. So there's one big flat sheet of rubber, and everything went well, but I think the plastic boots were kind of leaking, and then ultimately we had a leak in the rubber and we couldn't find the hole. So we pumped everything back out onto Hollywood Boulevard that night into the gutter. Number 2, fly 4 drones in synchronization, scanning Mies's Haus Lange and Haus Esther's in Krefeld, Germany. So if anybody's familiar with these projects, they're not twins, they're kind of doubles, and they're 2 clients that Mies had in the 1930s. And the thing that's holding them together are these really large picture windows. And so I was interested in having 2 drones scan the rear facade. This is the famous facade. In synchronization, kind of layer by layer, brick by brick, coursing. And then there's 2 other drones filming the other 2 drones doing all the work. So the name of this project is called Faux Brick. And I'm arguing Mies is using brick. It's fake. If you look at the drawings of these 2 houses, there is a lot of steel inside. And at the time, this is not being used as load-bearing masonry walls. This is basically a veneer. So the drones are collecting pictures, data, in what I'm calling, we get back to the studio in what I'm calling a bad mesh. So it's not an intricate, perfect mesh. It has problems with it. And really the project is, again, starts with questions and not really knowing the outcome or the answers. So we get back into the studio and I start to think about kind of old renderings and the aesthetic of renderings when they first came out. And so there would be a bitmap and we could tile it and you would see all the seams in the rendering. And so how to maybe combine three things, the bad mesh, a bad bitmap, and a bad bump map, and start to play with materiality because the faux brick is no longer brick and it might be these other materials. And so really it's a project on representation and potentially a new materiality. And so these are the kind of starting points. And they're going through those three things together. And so the bump map might be kind of a misaligned grout pattern for the brick. And so here's an image of brick, but the grout is now pink, millennial pink, and it's offset to like where the grout line should be. This is a fieldstone bump map superimposed with like OSB board. And then vinyl siding, two versions of vinyl siding, both the scalloped shingle and then like the horizontal. Number 3, make public space that is strange or that people want to get married in. So this is a project called Another Axon, and this is located on the Boston Greenway. It was a temporary installation put on by the pinkcomma gallery in the Boston Design Biennial. And so again, small budget, but we need like maximum effort is how I understood the brief. So I picked the dumpiest site, and this is the off-ramp to the I-93. And so cars are kind of like sitting here queued up coming out of the tunnel. And so everything's constructed around one vantage point, which is like a 6-story adjoining parking garage. And so everything from that view snaps into this axonometric view. And so, you know, this is what happened when you do temporary public work in the public realm. It's like photographed in particular ways and collected on Instagram. This is, there's 11 objects in total. And so these are minimal art sculptures that have been downloaded from Google SketchUp Warehouse and then kind of put through this axonometric machine. Very interested in asking the question, is a drawing architecture? And so everything gets played out like landscape architecture hatches, both on these like a stand of 12 trees, and then this synthetic turf. We're using all kind of ordinary materials, so people driving by understand that this is vinyl siding that's also on their house, but it's turned incongruent to the objects in which it was installed. This is a plan drawing, which kind of looks like an axonometric drawing. This is actually a perspective drawing, which is that perfect view from the parking garage. And then this is an axonometric drawing of another axon. The next two projects are a collaboration that I had with Christian Steiner. We did a series of public art projects post-recession in 2010, really trying to push conceptual work and have a client. But this one actually was for a design biennial. So number 4, install an olfactory project in the mechanical room of the Istanbul Modern Museum. We were given maybe like a 15-foot wall space to exhibit our drawings on olfaction. And we said, well, that's not really impactful enough. And so we worked with French perfumer Christophe Laudemille. He designed 2 scents that would be hacked into the HVAC system and play on timers through the length of the biennial. So this is the situation from the Bosphorus, and inside Christophe is kind of playing these 2 scents. And just to say, yeah, if you're given 15 feet of space on a wall, you do the drawings, you frame them nicely, but then you might also consider thinking about how to have a larger impact at an institution like this. But we almost got kicked out, but then someone on the board heard about the project and kind of saved us, so we were able to do it. Number 5, rent a green screen to convince clients of micro enterprise projects in North Miami. And so we were in Los Angeles at the time, and green screens, you can rent them very cheaply, and you can kind of make these homemade videos. So this is the team, Christian and Jermaine and I. And we actually won the project, so this is, unfortunately it was never built, but our proposal was to put on these small, to work with the zoning code and to put these small masses onto individual houses to kind of upstart businesses inside the home. So recording studio, a hair salon, and a bicycle repair might be attached to the home, but also kind of creep into the home and change the internal planning. Number 6, throw a picnic for architecture. So I think this is what Felipe was talking about. This is a project called Best Sandwiches, where I'm interested in looking at sandwiches as a typology and then kind of grafting it into architecture. And so this is a grilled cheese. Then I worked with food photographer Adam Detour to photograph them in his studio, and of course they needed to be on plates or a picnic blanket. And it's really, again, asking the question, you know, can we think about non-extrusion in architecture? Can we start to think about the stack or the pile as being options for us when thinking about a mid-rise tower? And so this is a, you know, everything I try to do is highly conceptual, but then I also want to turn it into a real building. So this summer we looked at making this a spec office tower for the city of Atlanta, and in talks with developers about how to proceed. Number 7, exhibit work in U-Hauls and parking lots outside of major art institutions. So this isn't my idea. This is some colleagues' idea. Danielle Rago, Courtney Kaufman, Jonathan Louie, and James Michael Tate banded up and said, okay, we're going to rent these U-Hauls and we're going to exhibit 15 emerging practices in LA in the Mocha Geffen parking lot at the same time as this show was meant to be inside, and it was called New Sculpturalism, and it had all the Frank Gehry's, Tom Main, Neil Denari exhibiting their work inside. So it was kind of this symbolic gesture. And so this is Jermaine showing our work in that Opalaka project. And I just want to pause on this slide for a moment, and it's from 2013. So I think like post 2018, spring of this year, like during the Me Too movement, when it started to hit architecture, I think that any kind of given curated show, when a band is formed or a publication is made about a generation of architects, I think things are different moving forward. So not only do we have to be architects and creative thought leaders, but we also, it's our job to hold a generation accountable. Number 8, create a discourse around architecture of the Dirty South via guidebook. So this is a project that I did with graduate students at Georgia Tech, where I really use the analogy that happens in the rap industry between the West Coast, East Coast rappers, and started to ask the question, like, what is the architecture of the Dirty South? All in an effort to kind of redirect attention away from the two coasts. And so it's part real, it's a real guidebook. You can look up the places and go visit. But then the last kind of icon is fake, and this, you have these like fold outs. This book's designed by Neil Donnelly. You all are familiar with his work since his recent visit. And so this is a proposal where one of the students was looking at what architecture might be kind of post-Portman. So this is a project of like mini atria. So the first half of the book is about real sites and places and projections. And the second half of the book is a series of interviews. And these interviews are with architects like John Portman and Denise Scott Brown, as well as like a chef, a local chef, and historic preservationist. But this one I wanted to pull out because we actually got to interview Goody Mob, who you all know is the group that coined the term Dirty South, and so we get to ask them real questions. And you're gonna have to buy it to know the answer, but they ask, they kind of led on as to why they think Atlanta got the Olympics in 1996. So I'll let you dig into that. It's on Amazon. So. Number 9, question how architectural models are displayed. So this is I was asked to be the faculty editor of a book at the GSD called Platform, and I was given a room full of brown and white chipboard models. And the idea was to work with a food photographer and also look at the work of Barbara Kasten, an artist who in the 1980s threw colored light with colored gels onto kind of still life constructions in her studio. And so the idea was to kind of temporarily light and color these models and to see if that might make a difference inside the school, or to be kind of a projection for students. Here, we might start to use color, and might we use it in this way? So if you don't really want to make models out of colorful materials, you can temporarily do it with colored light. And so the book is out in the world, and it has just ran a second printing in Mandarin, and so I'm super excited to see how that effect might continue to affect the discipline of architecture. Okay, the very last one, and then we'll move on to the house. Number 10, throw a pool party in Los Angeles, but with no water this time. I was asked to be the guest editor of a contemporary art magazine called Art Papers out of Atlanta. It's been running since the 1970s. And this issue was supposed to be about architecture and design, and the chief editor said, well, it has to be about Los Angeles. And so I was able to commission 35 contributors, which are writers, architects, theorists, and critics, to look at how the swimming pool and other watery spaces affect LA's architecture and design culture. And that was out just last year. Okay, how are we doing on time? I don't see time anywhere. We're good? Just keep going. I just felt, I'm like, usually talk slower. I'm like trying to talk really fast for some reason. Okay, so to describe House Gables, I'd like to place emphasis on 3 models. 1, the massing model, 2, the dollhouse model, and 3, the one-to-one model. So a way into the massing model is through the ordinary. Ordinary architecture is often overlooked. It's not part of the canon. It's a throwaway. The ordinary is immediately accessible, but usually tossed aside. And here I'm interested in what I'm calling the contractor stockpile of all things pertaining to the roof, such as eaves, ridges, valleys, rakes, soffits, gables, hips, and dormers. In the contractor camp, there are endless variations of the domestic roof pitch. And in these suburban houses, current modes of construction promote building vented roofs, yet the unvented roof allows visual connection to the underbelly of the roof, potentially setting up a spatial interior. And so the research began by taking a random sampling of 50 houses in the city of Atlanta, cut through 8 different neighborhoods. And we began to reread the banal forms as exciting massing models. So rendered in all white, ordinary construction aesthetic is absent. An abstraction points us towards another potential construction method. And so we started to notice a few tendencies about the collection. Firstly, the roof geometries in more affluent neighborhoods, the roofs are more convoluted, elaborate, and complex. So in object number 47, there's 8 roofs that kind of require a mashup to cover a plan of a 6,000 square foot villa. And this is in Buckhead, which is one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city. While the lower socioeconomic neighborhoods have more humble roof lines, like in object number 41, which is probably a shotgun house with a singular hip roof. As the recipient of the Young Architects Forum Emerging Voices Award, I was asked to make a solo exhibition in a 10,000 square foot gallery space. It consisted of 16 massing models measuring 3 foot by 5 foot by 3 foot. And just to say, I didn't apply for this award, someone just called and I said, well, what does that mean? And they said, well, you're gonna show your work. And I was like, well, I don't have any work. So I really am thankful to whoever called me that day because I was able to produce this large body of work, kind of to the scale of the space. And so in these next series of slides, you can see how we've absorbed lessons learned from observing the everyday into a formal study. Massing models are usually small in size and the result of a iterative design process by the architect. They represent the schema, the diagram, and proto-architecture. Lacking detail and often made out of a singular material, massing models distinguish differences in a volumetric study. The models are scaled up to an awkward size without the luxury of more detail or information. They certainly weren't transportable and didn't fit in our frame of our foam wire cutter, nor did they sit comfortably on a client's conference room table. Intentionally inflated, they merely represent themselves, no longer a representational stand-in for something else. So the massing models were then removed from the gallery and drugged back out into the city and delivered as yard art back where the original roofs were sampled. I have a lot of images of these, but I'm only showing one tonight, sadly. Okay. So like the massing model, the second model, what we could call the dollhouse model, is concerned with the representation, but also presents two alternative motives. Number one, materials, and number two, the possibilities for that new spatial paradigm that I mentioned before. So on the second floor plan, which is at the top, the roof consumes the plan while roof rooms discretize and dominate the plan logic. So in this section, this first one here on the left, you can see that there's a room being held up by the roof. So that's what I'm calling these roof rooms. And at the 1 to 12 scale, these materials are graphic, they represent pop, and they are not what they seem. House Gables faux finishes are caught somewhere between the Southern Institute of Faux Finishing, which is a real place in Brandon, Mississippi. I mean, y'all are in Virginia. You have weird stuff around you, too. You just have to look for it. And Mary Corse's white light paintings from the 1968. So Mary Corse begins to paint with glass beads, and these glass beads are really common. They're from the Department of Transportation, and they're used in our road striping on our roadways. So these are the kind of two references to kind of build upon what Felipe was talking about earlier. Cited in the American South, the project undertakes an old tradition of faux finishing. For Southerners, there's a history of not being able to afford precious materials and the subsequent desire of faking it. And so this is on site, House Gables after it was installed. So on the left is a photograph of the faux brick exterior finish, kind of right at dusk. And on the right is an image where I'm just using a flash from my iPhone. So you can see kind of how the glitter works when your eye is behind the light. So when I was on site and I was describing this process that I had developed with really smart students at the GSD of how to make these faux bricks, and I was trying to describe the process to subcontractors, they said, well, we know how to do that. We've done it on all these Arby's. And I was like, oh, okay. So it's a commercial product. It's a sticker, and you stick it on. And so there's basically this 55-foot-long drawing of brick stuck onto the wall. They then trowel the top layer. But the thing that Arby's doesn't have that we have at House Gables is the glitter. So talking about faux finishes on the interior, there's a strategy to use like something like that looks like black terrazzo, but it's no longer poured in place. It arrives on site as a thin veneer tile. Or there's an idea of trying to make rooms look like marble, but they're really made out of vinyl. And so the yellow and the gray are vinyl. And then in the bathroom, there's a kind of drawing of cartoon. It's like a cartoon drawing of marble. And so these are how the faux finishes kind of are arranged in plan. And so they're all covering up all this effort that was made structurally, which is the cross-laminated timber panel, which I'll describe in a moment. And so these are some of the shots. We recently had an open house, and I found some of these on Instagram. And before I move into the next model, just to say, the site is a urban site where we have a variance for a 3-foot setback instead of a 6-foot setback. So technically, the next house built would be 6 feet over. On the right side, there's a warehouse, and behind that warehouse is something called the Beltline. So some of you might be familiar. This is a development that is like radically changing the city of Atlanta. The New York Times calls it a glorified sidewalk. I wasn't really happy with that title, but it really is something that's driving development and people like walking in the South, which doesn't happen when it's so hot, but it's actually connecting a lot of city life together in an interesting way. And now to the final and third model is the one-to-one model. So this is 87 CLT panels being assembled together with a 40-ton crane, and you can see it on the right there. Everything was assembled in 14 days' time with a 4-person crew. The one-to-one model is real. It's no longer a representational model, and it describes the reality of building a massing model. So this is the second house constructed out of CLT in the country, the first one being in Seattle by another female architect named Susan Jones. It became a very difficult project. There were 4 engineers, one being Hanif Kara of Adams Carla Taylor in London, who was really the concept engineer and really one of my mentors that pushed me to do a project like this and to take a lot of risks. The second engineer is out of New Hampshire called Benson Wood. They're really working with me on design development. And then the third engineer, the house is being farmed out for mass timber calculations, a group called Fire Tower who specializes in mass timber. And then the fourth engineer is the engineer in Atlanta that's connecting the CLT box to a concrete box on site. You can see on the left these piles and piles of CLT arriving throughout the week. So usually architects aren't really taking on logistics as well, but we had to figure out how to get 11 truckloads of panels to the site and staged appropriately. This is after the first day. There's like 10 panels up. It kind of feels like half a house. It went super quick. This is a set of drawings that the installers were from Seattle, and they didn't have a computer at the site looking at which panel to install next. It was literally, and there's 87 panels, and so there's 87 drawings. We also used, like the engineers, they labeled each connection. Everything's held together. I always do this, but like 14-inch screws. And so there's all these angles so that the screw doesn't penetrate towards the interior, especially on the roof. The product's made in Austria. It's called KLH. And so Hanif sent somebody over to Austria to check the product before it got sent in 3 open-top shipping containers. Again, this is all kind of stressful because it's going to be on the ship for 4 weeks, and it arrives at the Port of Savannah and then trucked over on these 11 hotshot trailers. These are the kind of angles. They're all, each one is custom, obviously, and extreme. And so there was just piles and piles of this material. I guess this is the drone crane shot view. Sorry, there's going to be a few kind of cheesy drone shots coming. This is the installer, Terry Ducott. I think that's this somehow heroic position of one of the biggest panels. It's 35 feet long. So the the walls are 3-ply CLT, the floor is 7-ply, and the roof is 5-ply. And so these all make up kind of a superstructure. And then I think at the end of this one, the drone kind of pans back to the city of Atlanta, and there's the towers by John Portman. And so this is really like a project that's taking on risk and trying to kind of do development and experimentation kind of in the way that Portman worked on the super atrium typology for Atlanta. How to fast this up? Okay, there's John Portman. So this shot is kind of exciting to me because you can see, you know, kind of a gable here, and you look directly up, and that gable's on alignment. Not planned, but obviously when you're working on the ordinary, these alignments kind of happen. And so I would say this is the domestic cats trying to be built as a model, right? So the house is actually a model. This is before the windows and things got in. Yeah, so it's as close as possible as the domestic hats work, but with real stuff like windows and downspouts. Okay, so everything I've shown you is just from the iPhone, it's including this image. So I just worked with the architectural photographer Tim Hersley last weekend, and so I'm taking these shots on my phone right behind him. So this is kind of a little sneak peek preview of what it might look like. We lit the house, and Tim is really interested in light. And this is like us at 4:45 waiting for the dawn to break, which is very early. And then midday and how the texture of the faux brick kind of looks on the exterior when the sun is hitting it directly. And with the windows down, trying to read more and more like a massing model. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Very good.
Do you want an image up?
Sure. We can leave. Choose one.
More colorful one, or?
I would say no, but you like color, so we're gonna have this discussion. Here, have some faux vodka.
Yeah, that's a lot of vodka.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. I think not only did you cover an incredible amount of, I think, important topics, but you did it with great sense of humor. So I'm sure there was nobody that was asleep while you were presenting.
I didn't see any. Yeah.
That's for sure. So let me start the conversation by asking a couple of questions. I had thought of a few questions in advance, but in looking at your presentation, I'm going to reverse some of them slightly. And the first one has to do with your reference to Venturi, and then your investigation of the different roof lines, right, as a socioeconomic map, as a way to read the city. Venturi's and Denise Scott Brown, in learning from Las Vegas, their greatest invention was to actually take a very traditional technique, right, the figure ground, and use it to map luminosity. They were thrown tomatoes, by the way, when Learning from Las Vegas just came out. They were seen by the architectural community as
like undoing the Noli plan.
Yeah, and looking at a geography that was not worth investigating, right? The strip was beneath architecture. And in many ways, what I think is fascinating about your work in Atlanta is that sort of with the prominence of Google Earth, we are beginning to look, roof lines have become more important than ever. So beginning to look at them as a way through which the ordinary can actually begin to, one, generate a singular project, but then begin to give us cues as to how, from this project, we can begin to redefine a larger topography in the city is fascinating.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could give us a little bit of the background as to how do you see this, not as a physical model, but as an urban model.
I mean, it's interesting you bring up the Google Earth, because when I clearly remember when there was these research assistants working with me, I thought they were going to go out in their car, take photographs, bring back to me, we were going to see which were the top 50. And it's like almost I wasn't thinking. They dialed into Google Earth and was like, here they are, Jennifer, and we don't need to go there. I was like, don't we need to go there and look at the neighborhood and understand? But they were arguing, like you said, we can read it just from the top view. And then we also know some data about the neighborhoods and like what's going on there financially. And so, yeah, it was all done, which I haven't thought about it in that way. But I guess what is interesting to me is like this kind of close reading of something, which is, I think a lot of architects do close readings. But it's trying to read something that shouldn't be read, right? And to kind of flip the roof in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think continuing on the theme of the roof, right? At the beginning of your lecture, you actually sort of made an argument about sort of the Le Corbusier and the free plan, the round plan, and then your plan. But you never showed us a plan.
I showed one.
There was one, but you
This is
went
also-
by it. You went by it quite quickly. And I think for me, the question is, what have you kept from Le Corbusier and from Rose, and what do you dismiss? And what I'm really asking is, what is your editing process beyond sort of producing something new?
Yeah, so there's just this hunch that we need to push back on the paradigms before us in some way. I have to admit I haven't done the work yet to work out like exactly what the free plan gives us, exactly what the wrong plan, and what the free plan might unlock. But it's that essay that I need to write post like construction of the house. I also am open to hear speculation. I mean, this is why you do these public talks, right? To hear other people's reading on like what you've been kind of zeroed in on. So be formulating what you guys think. But when you look at Loos's Moiler house, there are all these finishes on the interior that are like kind of wild. You know, there's the marble and they stop and start in strange places. So, you know, maybe I'm not rejecting those plans, but I wonder if there's things that I can tease out of it to then grow this new argument about the roof plan, which might need a little bit of both previous paradigms to like make the case for the new one. Because at first I'm like, oh, we have to reject it, like we can't do it. But then actually I think there is something about the wrapping of materiality per room plan that might push back into the roof. So that the roof doesn't always have the kind of hierarchy, right? That there's some kind of secondary tension.
No, I think in a way, I think the sort of moving beyond the roof. Another thing that for me was fascinating, especially in the introductory slides, is the way that with an incredible sense of humor, also in some of the later models, in a way you use public installations as a way to develop a larger discourse, right? There's the role of the architect, not just as an investigator of form, but as a public activist, bridging the world of sort of, in many ways, art in the public domain and the production of a body of work.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you could also speak a little bit about that affinity within your work.
Well, I mean, there's this I remember Sylvia Lavin was giving these like talks in LA at the time where she was saying, she was trying to kill the pavilion architects. So y'all have a few pavilions outside. All of architecture, we're doing these pavilions, inserting them in galleries. They're temporary. We're testing materiality. We're testing digital processes. And I remember her saying, well, you don't want to be a pavilion architect. And she would push the button and show like 200 pavilions. And it was very overwhelming. So I was like, no, I don't want to be a pavilion architect. But we have to produce things, materials out in these like temporary biennials. We have to be in the public. So what do you do if you're not about materiality and digital? I mean, I use digital fabrication, but that's not the thing I want to talk about. And these budgets are low, so I start to look to like ordinary materials, like how can you get like vinyl siding donated, and how many lengths of it can I get? But it's also like an effort to like put something back into the public that people can question and they understand it in some way, but also to try to flip it into like high conceptual as soon as possible. And so when I was installing this thing, it was like a lot of work. I'm not going to do that anymore. It was so hard. I heard a lot of like reactions to people because what is this? Is it art? Is it architecture? Why is there trees here? Well, because there's, it's a commentary on like the trees on the Boston's Greenway. There's an effort to work inside the public realm, but also work on very specific architectural questions. Because in that one, it was like, can drawing be architecture? And I say it can be. And this is the drawing that I worked really hard on, and then I tried to build it.
Yeah, but in a way, I think this issue of using conventional materials in unconventional ways, for me, it actually has an interesting link to your broader education, right? And we could argue that in many ways, rural studio, that practice comes from rural studio. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, what are the moments in your education, right, that were most influential for the development of this body of work?
Yeah, so I was a student at the Rural Studio and did my 5th year thesis. It's like the B-Arc here, right? You have a
we have a 4-year Bachelor in Science.
So yeah, it's a B-Arc program there. In the 5th year, you do a thesis. But Samuel Mockbee had set up this program called the Rural Studio, which was to take students away from Auburn University out into the middle of West Alabama into a very poverty-stricken area, and said, build architecture and build it for this community. But what he did, what I think was like so clever, and he won a MacArthur Genius Grant because he was a genius, which was not to say that architecture is more important than the client, and not to say that the client is more important than architecture. So he really instilled on us, we have to experiment on architecture, and it has to be strange forms and strange materialities, and so there was like a nice balance of like kind of doing both, and definitely. I was a student at the GSD, and I'd never heard this word typology before. And so I think taking type, well, okay, it doesn't have to just be like office types. I guess it could be sandwich types. And so like trying to think how to play typology, in some way.
Very good. I think with this, we can actually open it up to the audience and maybe expand the conversation. So who's going to be the first?
And somebody has to help with the roof plan idea.
Over here, Robin.
Well, I don't know if I can help with the roof plan exactly, but an interesting observation relative to your deal with the free plan and representation is there was a moment in the 60s when the axonometric was the only drawing you really could do if you wanted to be cool. And what that meant was that the largest surface area you saw was the roof. And so then what happened was that the free plan was predicated on elimination of the roof as a centering device, meant that all of a sudden if you were intelligent, you would look at this vast roof that was flat and say, I can't show that. So the roof started to take on, not quite in the way you're dealing with it, but started to take on an animated form, I think primarily due to a mode of representation. So then you combine that with Venturi, and it gets interesting.
No, this is very helpful. Thank you so much. Yeah. And what about the worm's eye view, which was
That's it, yeah.
trying to get away maybe from that vast blank flat roof and like show the ROM plan? Maybe, I don't know. Yeah.
I have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mona.
Yes, thank you for the lecture. The intelligent thoughts that you're showing at us is super interesting. I'm not an expert on laws at all, but the way how I saw this a little bit in your presentation, the round plan really starts to interlock volumes, so the plan becomes volumetric, and the volumes are very much driven through programs. So the storage locker is lower, the living room becomes larger, and the whole building is a composition out of a three-dimensional plan that is very much driven through functionality. And you're basically looking at all of these roofscapes. You are taking, since it is not architecture at all, you're abstracting it and resampling it. You make it a really dominant sculptural exhibition, and then you're allowing it to dominate the volume at the end. So the house is literally growing from the top down rather than from the bottom up. But the interesting thing is, I find, when you then look at the section, you have the most amazing sectional conditions. There's even loads sneaking in on one side where you have the volume that creates the gallery in the section. So it's a collage of it, but it's not driven by program at all. I think it's really driven through the sculptural effects of the roof plan that then create amazing interior spaces. And at the end of the day, we all want to live in amazing spaces. So it's very convincing.
Okay, thank you so much. That's also super helpful.
First off, thank you very much for the talk. It was really great. And War Eagle.
War Eagle.
As someone from Alabama who is trending northward, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about your the reasons you returned to the South and what it means to you to be a Southern architect, and maybe why you chose Atlanta specifically.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I was educated, obviously, in the South, grew up there, then went away to London, then came back to the East Coast to get a master's, and then started teaching on the West Coast. And then I was like, oh, and then I was around colleagues from UCLA, and they were saying something different. And it just became very confusing as to where I should head. Because I kind of liked what they were saying too. And so going back to this position at Georgia Tech and working with students, it really felt like kind of going home, although I'm not from Atlanta. But and I thought, okay, how can I start to ask these questions? How can we maybe redirect attention from the East and West Coast? Like, who can we think of has made a big effort in pedagogy in the South, you know, in Atlanta specifically? And so it was just a strategy to kind of look at the city and kind of all these strange urban patterns that, I mean, they do weird things there, like tear down buildings and then move them or store them in storage and then reassemble them back together into pavilions, although they were like pieces of heavy facade before. Or like I.M. Pei's first building ever is in Atlanta. They tore it down, they stored it, and they put it back together as like a front lobby for an apartment complex. So like there's just all these really weird things, and I felt like, you know, we needed to look at it and then kind of capture those things in a guidebook. But no, I mean, I think, and then also it's not by chance that I built Haus Gables in Atlanta. There's an effort to try to, maybe I'm on the East Coast, but there's an effort to try to make work there, and then maybe go back there one day. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, the last time, I guess maybe other faculty in the room could help. The last time we talked about vernacular architecture was around this critical regionalism conversation. And, you know, what's the next way of talking about these things is something I'm curious about.
Any other questions? There's one.
Oh, And I forgot to mention Carly Rickles is here. She designed the landscape for House Gables, and she's a prospective student in your PhD program.
Very good. Welcome.
I had written that down, but.
Chris?
Sorry, it's a little weird hearing your own voice. I have two questions. So I've kind of been influenced by you and a few others with lighting and using that with architecture. And you use it on this model scale, and I thought it was interesting how you scaled up the models. I was wondering if you ever scaled up your lighting techniques with your larger scale work and how you can address that in the actual architectural field and starting to shift physical one-to-one space.
Yeah, the dollhouse model is 1 to 12, and it's, kind of this big. And I had just done the still life work, and so I thought, well, if I'm doing it on everybody else's work, shouldn't I look at what the dollhouse looks like with the same lighting condition? But what's interesting, last week working with Tim Hersley, he came from Little Rock, Arkansas, and brought 3 lights with him. And I think I would have freaked him out if I would have said, let's put colored gels on those lights. So we didn't, but the images I showed at the very end was like that kind of soft white glow. But yeah, I think that's a really good idea. I mean, projections are happening on buildings with colored, like the Empire State Building or whatever, like lights up pink during Cancer Month. There's like all these things that are happening with events in society or culture related to building stock. And so how do we not make it like that, what that's happening, but something else? But I think that's an interesting idea I haven't thought about.
Also, I have a question, technicality-wise. Do you have any preferred type of light that you use, and also any type of gel that you use to do these things? Sorry.
We worked for 2 weeks on constructing those 17 still lifes, and I was like right there with the photographer doing it, but I kind of missed the technical stuff that he was doing because it was happening at such a fast speed. I don't know, Roscoe or something might be the colored gels. But he really, I showed him like Barbara Kasten's work, and he really kind of learned it. He hadn't used it before either. So I think it's about experimentation and just seeing what you can get.
Before we go to the next question, I'm going to interrupt there because I cannot let you escape without asking you a question about color. And in many ways, when we look at your work, there's an incredible sort of use of color to create a particular set of atmospheres, right? But if you actually look, for example, at the stack sandwiches, their differentiation is typological. It's not about codification with color. So how is the color performing within your work? Why those colors? What is the larger collection and effect that color establishes in your work?
So I think we all are very good at whites, blacks, and grays, and that's what we've been, we're just good at it because that's what we've been working with. So I guess I don't really understand color, but I'm trying to learn it and to like throw it in. So either it's through materiality or through its colored gels. The sandwiches were actually a collaboration with somebody I found on Instagram that does these renderings from Los Angeles. And so, I was like very terrified to do renderings, and I'd only took photographs of models generally for my work. But you think like, okay, do you do photorealism renderings? Do you work with students? Do I push the render button myself? Like, it was like confusing how to kind of set the rendering up. But, I think I have to mention this sounds a little cliche, but I have to mention like Instagram and the role of which we're all viewing images at a very fast pace. I spoke to the students earlier about this. We're not waiting on the one magazine to show up in the office, which is what the generation before us did to see what colleagues were building in Los Angeles or wherever. We can see it like 15 seconds after people post it. And so the rate at which color images are shared, they're becoming more and more visceral, more graphic, more, I think like there's no, maybe there'll be like some turning back.
Oh, for sure.
And some pushback, and things will all start being white and black and gray again. But I don't want to say that I'm just a part of like whatever's happening, but I'm definitely trying to understand it and to work inside of it.
I think we have one.
Yeah, this is just sort of for me and my brain, but kind of circling back to materiality. You, as a fellow purveyor of McMansions and sort of their je ne sais quoi of faux-ness that I love, I just wanted to ask you about like the nature of faux materials and what do those like mean to you, not just in like finishing, but like the architectural imagination.
I mean, it kind of goes hand in hand with color. Like when you're a new architect and you, new meaning this was my first building, I don't know how to pick materials, you know, so it's really sitting down and seeing, okay, do you do 2 materials and limit the palette? Do you do 17? How do they get combined? What's the story behind 4 rooms kind of colliding together in plan? The other thing about materiality, I think, which I don't talk about, is about function. So the CLT is routed in the factory, and it's routed so that the electrical cables can come up to the electrical outlet. And so instead of plugging that with CLT wood, it probably is going to like not look so good. The idea was to use wainscoting and wrap up the wall surfaces. So the wainscoting in those materials and the faux finishes are covering something like a sticker. And so if you think about it being thin and a sticker and graphic and not like this deep reveal or something, I mean, that's kind of where I was going.
Oh, yeah. I think it's, yeah, right here. Microphone's coming.
Thank you for your amazing project. And I've noticed that you showed one project on the background of Instagram. And my question is, what kind of influence do you think that digital community and social media will have on architecture issues like space atmosphere? Thanks.
So the question is, what does Instagram push back onto architecture?
What influence do you think that digital community and social media will have on architecture issues like space atmosphere?
Yeah, so I think it kind of what I said before, like Instagram and social media are things that are happening very fast, and so there's images creating very fast and then being shared and liked, and so I think, you know, there was like a recent New York Times article about the role of Instagram and architecture. So people make Instagram walls, and then you go there and take selfies with it, or there's, you know, museums like the ice cream museum that's temporary. You dive into sprinkles and you take a selfie. And so I didn't read the article, I just read the headline. But there's, you know, it's definitely having an effect. That's not the discipline though, that's more like marketing.
Right.
So I think we still need to figure out what the discipline, how it affects the discipline.
Maybe we have time.
Do you have, sorry.
Go ahead.
Do you have an idea of how to phase out the connection between digital community and architecture?
I can't figure out everything.
I think
haven't
that's
thought-
that's a lecture in of itself.
Thank you.
Any other? We have maybe time for one last question. No. Isla,
I was going to make
a comment.
maybe a comment. This was in response to your question around typology, because we've been around this block, except that before, even though it comes back in a new form. So, in the last time, in the late 70s, early 80s, we were dealing with this notion of typology. So there were some that were countering it. You know, one was Frank Gehry working with Oldenburg at the time because he was resisting, let's say, historical typologies, and that's how you ended up with fish and binoculars. Didn't go the route of sandwiches, but that's one to think about. Yeah.
Well, Yeah, hopefully, yeah, so I hope that the sandwiches aren't read as like a metaphor for architecture, like the binocular, or Oldenburg's binoculars. Did they also do that Longa burger basket? Yeah, there's several. There's
Oldenburg's is sort of interesting because it's
puffed up and like scaled up objects that kind of like blow your mind. They should, like, toothpaste shouldn't be that big, or no.
they become, I mean, you know, they become something else entirely, you know, while still retaining the kind of relationship. But I think, you know, that whole practice in some way was doing that. And that's why Gary was also working with Oldenburg to kind of deal with the objects, but operating at another scale.
Yeah, so Gary's collection of objects was sitting beside
Efficient objects, you know,
Oldenburg.
but no
Yeah.
sandwiches.
No, I hope it doesn't get read as a metaphor or like of that generation. So I need to do harder work to, make sure that we're learning, that we can find something new, either in like structural stacks or piles, or I don't know, something more about extrusion. Because if you think about like an office tower, it's hard to break extrusion when you need to replicate floor plates. So yeah, maybe you can do it on kind of isolated, specific chunks, which are more cheese-like or hamburger-like or something. I don't know.
Very good. No, but in a way, going back to one of the previous questions or comments, there is, in many ways, a certain sense of contestation of contemporary canons in your work, and
There's a lot going on. Yeah.
and you never, you don't really reveal what those are, and I think that's a good strategy. I think the day you actually answer that directly, you'll make a disfavor to your work. I think you need to let people figure it out. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
That was very good. Yeah. And thanks to everyone for being here. There's a reception outside.